Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast. My name is David. Very glad that you guys are with me. This is episode 96. With me, as always, is Pastor Mike. Hello, Pastor Mike.
Hello, David.
Welcome to the Grow Podcast.
Thank you for welcoming me to where we are like every week.
Well, it's been a couple weeks since we recorded one of these.
You're right.
We're going to have to see if we remember how to record a podcast.
We probably don't. You probably have to retrain us.
Speak into the mic.
Oh.
That's the only part I remember.
Oh.
Yeah. We should do one podcast where we both have our mics there and we both just lean way back like this.
Michael's hating you right now. It's going to be like, why are you doing that?
It's still a conversational podcast, but it's like you're in a room where the conversation's happening, but you're not supposed to be listening. You know, it's more of a eavesdropping podcast.
I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts last night, and for some reason,
There's a sound in the room.
There is a sound in the room.
Oh, is it the fridge?
It's the fridge.
It's the fridge.
We have a fridge in the room.
Okay, sorry.
So if
continue.
you can hear that. And for some reason, they changed their audio, and it's always been good, but that one just sounded like there was an echo in the room. And it just ruined my whole podcast experience. So hopefully we aren't ruining it for people.
Yeah, I hope we're not ruining your whole podcast. If you would like an episode of an eavesdropping Grow podcast, please put that in the YouTube comments. I think that could be great.
Sounds like
maybe it'll be a special episode. We'll do an eavesdropping podcast.
Well, what are we doing for number 100? We talked about that a few weeks ago because we're just
we did.
A few away.
We shared some ideas. Producer, I don't think we settled on anything for episode 100.
Because episode 97 will be the last of the greatest story.
Hattie's the party planner. We should just put her in charge. That's what we did with episode 50. We just said, Hattie, you're throwing a party. She accidentally volunteered, and then we held her to it.
So 100. I think that'll be Memorial Day week, if my math is correct. It'll be pretty close.
Sure. Yeah. The days. Michael.
I just wrote all those messages yesterday. In timing. when we recorded this. So I've got that.
Michael has a weird skill. Michael Bierce, our online worship director, has a weird skill where I can say a day 9 months from now, a date, and he'll be like, "Oh, that's a Thursday." I'm like, "Why do you know
How
that?
Do you do that?
Weirdo."
I've heard
Are you
people
one of those
who are
people
like
too,
savants, who can do that, where you name.
I mean,
something.
apparently, just when it comes to calendars, he is a savant. I don't know if it translates to other. Yeah, and that's what he said.
As a worship leader,
what he just said is that's because I know what Sundays are, and that is fair. He's worked at a church a lot longer than I. But you've worked at a church longer than he has, and you have not developed that skill.
No.
What skills have you developed?
I'm not many. Not many. That's why they're sending me on to do something new. It's like he'll never get good at this. We're going to send him and try something new.
We gave you some time.
Yeah,
didn't work out.
Not working. Yeah.
What would you say? Okay, you've been a pastor for how long?
32 years.
32 years. What's one skill that you definitely have now that you didn't have 32 years ago, but not one that you would expect to learn as a pastor? So not like, oh, I'm much better at speaking on stage, or I'm good at, mourning with people at a funeral, something that we wouldn't expect.
Other than conflict management? That goes into...
I didn't like how you looked at me when you said conflict management.
Managing a facility and all of this stuff that goes... Nobody teaches you how to do that in the church world. Yeah, and I've had to get fairly good at it.
If you were president of a college that trained pastors, would you add a facility management course? Is it that important?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some important stuff that goes into it.
I feel like I've only worked here a little over 3 years now. But growing up with a father who was a pastor and then having a relationship with you, I feel like we're constantly talking about things that are like they don't... this is something we deal with all the time, and there's no training for it before you get here.
No, there's always something.
And that just always make who's running these schools where we're training our pastors? They don't seem to be former pastors who would be stressing these kind of things.
Well, and so much is academic, which is important.
Sure.
But you miss things. Like a lot of the training for even preaching is content oriented, which content matters.
Sure.
But they're just beginning to discover this. They don't deal a whole lot with communication.
Mm-hmm.
Well, content is awesome, but unless you can communicate it well, they just, and it's not just in the Christian world, it's in so many places, but that's where it gets frustrating. And then so much is leadership, and
Yeah.
they teach an academic side to leadership because they have to meet accreditation standards, but the accreditation standards have more to do with educational than applicational kind of things. So
Yeah.
yeah, you can get me going on that one for a little while.
Instead, I think we'll talk about Paul again.
Let's talk about
We
Paul.
talked about Paul last week.
We did.
But Paul was important enough that he gets 2 weeks of podcasts.
Well, he gets like half of the book of Acts in the New Testament, basically.
Yeah.
And
And then
most
he
of the
wrote
New
most
Testament,
of the rest of it.
you know,
Yeah.
about 2/3 of the books, 30% of the words in the New Testament. It's pretty amazing.
30% of the words.
Of the words.
I don't know if I've heard that specific
like that
stat
one?
before.
Yeah.
30% of the words in the New
Which,
Testament.
you know, at first when I heard that, it's like, how can you write 2/3 of the books but 30% of the words? Because there's some words that are a lot longer. Our books a lot longer.
Well, I was just going to ask about the words that are a lot longer. So, okay, go back to high school days or college days. Okay, you have to write a 500-word essay.
Yeah.
But they just use the little like algorithm, like the average word is this many letters long, so you can figure. But if you just use a whole bunch of short words, then like I used 740 words and I
every
still
other word
didn't
is
get credit.
as or to.
Yeah, exactly. Just keep throwing those out there. Maybe Paul was just using a lot of conjunctions.
Well, you think about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah.
Those are long, and the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
Just those 5 alone are massive. And then Hebrews, and we'll maybe get there today, whether that was written by Paul or not.
Yeah.
I personally don't think so. Most scholars don't. That's another long one. So almost all of the others are like, other than Romans, are fairly short.
And at the end of the podcast today, you are going to tell us definitively who did write Hebrews, right? Did I read that right? In the notes?
I actually do. We will give a thought because I do have a thought.
Okay.
I have a favorite thought, but there's not as much proof for it because there's one I just like.
Sure.
But then there's one I think there's more scholarly evidence for personally. But.
Well, we're going to talk about 2 of the books specifically that Paul wrote. Like you said, we might touch on a few other things at the end, but 2 of his books are I don't want to say they're more important than other ones, but they're
2 of the strongest theological grounding in the entirety of the New Testament.
And that's Romans and Galatians. Yep. And I think back to when I was at a Bible college, and there were very few classes that were only on one book of the Bible, and Romans had its own class, and Galatians had its own class.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty common at a lot of they're that important.
It's one of my favorite
when it comes
classes
to theology.
I ever took was
Which
the book on Romans.
Oh, Galatians was mine. Interestingly,
Romans,
shout out to Dr. Gianolis, my Galatians professor. Who was your Romans professor?
Dr. Mark Weeder.
Is he still with us?
Yes.
Oh, shout out to Dr. Mark Weeder as well. Well, I forgot where I was in my notes here. Just give me a second. Oh, they're among the first book. Yep. Well, they weren't books; they were letters that he wrote. But
Thessalonica, the letters to the Thessalonians were probably among the first, but these were just stronger, longer.
But we talked about how they're so important. So maybe that's the first thing we should touch on a little bit, because even for a lot of us who've consistently read the New Testament, maybe our whole lives, or at least a lot, what is it that makes Galatians and Romans so important?
Well, I think part of it was because these were really the 2 first theological teachings of what do we really believe and how do we define it in the early church. You know, and really in our faith, in the Christian faith, you go all the way back into the Old Testament and in Israel since the time of Moses. This our first real theological teaching. So these really, really matter for us, and they're foundational for us. I think it was Martin Luther in the 16th century said, "You give me the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the book of Romans and Galatians, and I can give you hope and an explanation of the gospel to any person, just those alone." But both these books are written to 2 different groups of people. So one is written to the Roman church, the church in Rome, where Paul had not been yet. But he lists like 26, if I remember right, 26 of the people there. So he knew 26 of the people in this little church. And then Galatia was written to a group of churches in kind of modern-day Turkey. But they were written with the same purpose. It's just evidently one of them took a much longer time because it was a much longer book. And that's to teach young believers the core message of Christianity. And so like when you read in Galatians 1, he says, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and turning to a different gospel. So he's trying to define for them what is the gospel, which is really no gospel at all. In other words, this false gospel. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion. So he's trying to teach them and to ground them in the faith. And at the beginning of Romans, it's kind of the same thing. He gets a little bit more declarative. He says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel. He says, we're going to talk about this. And then he defines what it is. It is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jew, and he talks about in that book why the Jewish people received it first, why that matters, and then to the Gentile. But it changes your identity. So he's defining for us what the gospel is. And then he says, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. In other words, you have the power by what Jesus did to become the person you were designed to be, to become right. He says it's a righteousness that is by faith. You can't earn it. And Galatians really hammers on that. From first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. So he just, those two things right at the top, he defines for us, this is what the gospel, this is what we've talked about already earlier, in our walk through the Bible, the euangelion, the best news. What does it really mean for us?
You read like the opening of Galatians there, where it very clearly is talking, like we understand why he wrote Galatians, right? There's this false gospel that's being taught, and they're falling towards. Do we have as clear of a understanding of why Romans was written?
It basically was a church that, to our knowledge, none of the apostles had been to. Including him. And so they're a young church. They wanted to make sure they started well. Yeah. So it wasn't necessarily, from what we understand, in response to, although he addresses some things, some concerns, but in response to specific, talk for a living, specific concern, but instead just to ground them. So it's kind of the first systematic theology.
Sure.
Is really what it was.
Well, let's jump in. Romans is your favorite.
It is.
So let's do Romans first. We'll save my favorite for a second.
Yeah, we'll let you outline Galatians.
No.
Okay. Well, you were more than capable.
I didn't bring my commentary with me, so we'll stick to your teaching for today.
Romans, actually, a little known fact, and that matters to no one but me. The first entire chapter of the Bible that I ever memorized outside of like a psalm was Romans 12. Still have most of it committed to memory. Yeah. I can at least summarize the whole thing. And then for some reason, I was just so drawn to this book, even before I took class in it. The outline of the book of Romans just matters because it's kind of like an outline of the Christian life. The first 3 chapters talks about our problem. We're messed up by sin and why we need forgiveness. And of course, in this is one of the more famous verses, Romans, 3:23. For all of sin fall short of the glory of God, in this area. And then chapters 4 through 7 begin to answer questions like, so if God's going to forgive us when we sin, then why not just keep sinning and God forgives us, and just kind of some of it rhetorical, but real questions. Yep. And then the last part of chapter 7 and chapter 8, which 2 of my favorite chapters, last part of chapter 7, he describes this kind of crisis that every Christian who's growing in Jesus comes to, where it's like, I still feel messed up and I still feel stuck. And how do I get free from this? And he begins to describe what we've talked about as sanctification, the process of God helping us to continue to surrender. And so he walks through this, and in chapter 12 begins to talk about the transformation that happens in us, the transforming of our mind, not being conformed to the pattern of this world, and how we serve and what different serving makes. And then chapters 13 through 15 just gets real practical in how we live as Christ followers. And this follows after this whole journey. So why I need Jesus, how I become a Christian, how I kind of live as a Christian, how I continue to surrender my life. And then he deals with some specific things like how do you deal with a corrupt government? That's in here, gratitude and thankfulness and those kinds of things. So that's a real quick outline of Romans.
What you mentioned some of your favorite parts about, but what is it about Romans specifically that makes it your favorite book, or at least your favorite New Testament book?
I think for me, it just, more than any other book of the Bible, it outlines our Christian journey.
Sure.
You can just see all of
the
us.
way
It's
through.
not linear for all of us. It's
Sure.
more like
Yeah.
up, down, back, forth, 5-step sword. And you can see it in here. Some of the questions is like, really? You're asking that question? But some people are asking that question. And it's just, whatever you're dealing with in any stage of the Christian life, I feel like Romans
Yeah.
has a principle, has a teaching for you.
You had in your notes too, and you didn't touch on it, but I'm gonna make you just like the order of things, at least in terms of what came last, which was the practical ways we live as followers. But why was it important that that's at the end?
Well, and that's part of it. Even connects to Galatians, because
Heavily.
we always drift towards rules. Well, let me put it this way. We always reject rules,
Yeah.
or we drift towards rules
Yeah.
instead of relationship. So, and especially when we're trying to live right, we all get caught in this where we're trying to turn things into rules. And so if he were to talk about, here's kind of how you live your life, before he talks about the relationship and how it transforms us, so many of us, and we would do this, we would turn it in a list of, okay, here's what I do, here's what I do, here's what I do, and check, and I'm okay. And so the rules matter, but they're rules for life and relationship. Like in any relationship, Kylie and I have boundaries in our marriage that once in a while, because of flexibility or whatever, we will cross. But they're just to help keep us, keep our relationship healthy and strong. The rules aren't the measure of our relationship. They're the boundaries of the relationship. Maybe it's the best way to say it.
Yeah. Moving into Galatians, which is my favorite. However,
why is it your favorite?
There's a few different reasons. It's interesting because it's my favorite, but it's not everyone that I suggest, like, a new believer, jump into Galatians. Because I remember in college, I had a friend at Crown who didn't really have much of a faith when he got there, and he was kind of diving more into it while he was there, and he read Galatians. And he knew it was the semester I was in my Galatians class, and he's like, this book is like just about circumcision. Like, I don't understand why it keeps talking about circumcision
it deals so much with how we drift the rules. Yeah.
And I was just like, well, it's not about that. That's just the example that he's using. That's not super relatable to our life now, but that's, to the people he was writing to, that was the context of this truth that he's teaching. But it's mine for a few different reasons. I think Paul's pretty sassy in Galatians, which I really love.
I can't imagine you being drawn to that.
I think, I connect with an author when you can like feel their personality more, especially like a nonfiction author, which obviously, clearly the Bible. And I just feel like his personality really comes through in Galatians, and I love that about it. I feel like I get to know Paul way more in Galatians than in most of his other books. But it also just it's Paul combating so much of what is frustrating to me about religion. And it was such an important book to Martin Luther because I don't know how that book existed with the church being what it was at the time, right? Like, how could you ever read that book and be like, yeah, we're nailing it right now? And not that we do it great now. It's not like we're perfect now either. There's a million things we could be like, oh, we're not doing this well. But that one, it's just so combative to what the church had been for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it took, one person basically to be like, we got to fix some stuff.
What's so fascinating, frustrating, and devastating to me is how cyclical we are as human beings. I mean, we saw it when we walked through the Old Testament. It's like, you keep repeating this, And so, like, coming out of the Old Testament, and I'll just use it in terms of the Bible, into the New Testament. So that time period, so much of what Judaism had become was not based on the laws of Moses. They had added all these other things. So what they were quoting was all this stuff that they had written, didn't come from God. And then you fast forward to 16th century or so, when Martin Luther is around, and so much of what Christianity, the new church, had become was in addition to Scripture and ignoring things like the book of Galatians. And it's just like, can we not learn from what we keep repeating? And we just keep getting caught in this pattern.
And even though it's not as like all encompassing as Romans is, for instance, I feel like for me specifically, as we've talked about this on the podcast before too, but as someone who who probably leans more towards the like academic side than the naturally than the relationship side. Even though, which is odd because as a person, I'm a very relational person, but that's just kind of how I've been in my spiritual. Like if I'm not paying attention, my spiritual life becomes very academic and I stray from the relational side. And Galatians really hits home on that one where it's like you can, like you're focusing on the wrong stuff. And it's just
so when you contrast the Romans and the book of Romans and Galatians. So Romans was written to head off by laying a solid foundation problems that Galatians was confronting.
Right.
So Galatians is more, I don't want to say reactionary, maybe responsive. And so it's going to be briefer because he's addressing specific things that Romans is not dealing with directly, is saying if you build this foundation, then this won't be an issue, basically.
Yeah.
And that's so much of Galatians is you're dealing with this, let's talk about this. You're dealing with this, let's talk about this. And so they have this group of people that were coming in and saying, yes, you follow Jesus, but make sure you follow him in the way that basically this pattern of rules over and over and over and over again. Let's practice the Jewish religion, but let's have a relationship with Jesus, and we measure our relationship by all the rules that are not in Scripture, at least the way that we understand them.
Yeah.
So it was a mess.
Why don't you walk us through Galatians?
A little bit easier because where Romans is 15 chapters, is only 6 chapters. And again, the chapters were added later just to help us understand that. So chapter 1 and 2 sets the foundation, but tells a lot of Paul's story. And this is where, like you're saying, it's personal. We get to hear some of Paul's story that we didn't get to hear even in the book of Acts. Yeah. So some of what happened to him. Chapters 3, 4, and 5, he begins to specifically address some of these questions and false religions and things, and he ties it into his personal life because I grew up in this, I was schooled in this, I had an Ivy League, education in this. So he's tying it into this and uses himself as an example. And then chapter 6. He just gets even more specific to kind of tie the knot at the end. But everything about Galatians is responsive to specific things. So if you're reading Galatians, always look for what question or what issue is he responding to, whereas Romans is laying the foundation. So if you think of it in terms of a building, Romans is, the foundation that's under the ground that everything else sits on, and Galatians is saying, oh, that wall was built crooked. How do we fix it?
Sure.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. I like to, when reading Galatians, I like to think about being at one of the churches, because it wasn't written to one individual church. It was a group of churches.
Yeah. Which Romans may have been too. There may have been multiple churches in Rome.
Sure.
But we just called it the Roman church.
Yeah. But being at one of those churches when they, Paul sent us a letter. Let's read it. And then and you're like one of those guys who's been teaching the false stuff, and you're like, and then he opens the first 2 chapters and he's just kind of, never mind, I'm good. Paul's just kind of telling us about what's been going on, and then the middle of the letter comes and he just starts
like, wait, he's talking about me? Can you imagine?
Kind of lulls you into a false sense of security. That's how I always like to think
Paul is a master in all of his letters of that way, of just kind of drawing you in and then jab. He was the first. My name is Paul. I'm your friend. If you're on New Hope, kind of thing.
Well, so those are again, it's weird to say they're the most important, but maybe the biggest, most vital letters to theology.
Really, 2 of the longest of Paul's. Yeah, I mean, Corinthians is on the edge, but
and then he wrote a bunch of other ones. Yep. So do you want to? We don't have a ton of time, but we'll kind of touch on some of those quickly. Some of the other ones. Or all of the other ones.
There were actually 3 letters that we know of to the Corinthian church. We only have 2. One was lost in time. So 1 Corinthians, the first letter, basically saying what a church should not look like. He's saying your church does not look like the way a church should look like. You aren't acting right. So it deals with that. 2 Corinthians, which is one of Paul's most personal, next to maybe Galatians, and we get a little bit further on in some of the pastoral letters. He describes his life and ministry, but he's responding. So they tried to correct some things that the first letter addressed, and they just went overboard. So he's like, all right, too far. Yeah, we're talking about that person who sinned, but you still need to talk to her. If she repented, you can let her back in. It's okay, Ephesians, which Galatians and Ephesians, I love. It's kind of a contrast to 1 Corinthians. Ephesians was like the model church. Yeah. They're a great church. Timothy led this church for a while. Some scholars believe that John may have even led that church for a while. So it's just positive church about the church. So it's not a response to a problem, but here's how you can go deeper in your faith. You have Philippians, how to deal with tough stuff with gratitude. Paul wrote it from jail, and it's the book about Thanksgiving. You've got Colossians.
One of the, maybe the most misused or misquoted verse in all of the Bible comes from Philippians, and especially in my world, of athletics. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Completely ignoring the context of what he's talking about. It's just...
If every athlete who used that to, as a God, I can do this, the Vikings would have won a Super Bowl somewhere along the way. I had to resist. You knew it was coming. Colossians, this is what we call in theological circles Christology. It's one of the most beautiful and great summaries of really what Christ did for us and why it matters. So it's not just content, of what he did, but why it matters to us. 1st, 2nd Thessalonians gives us comfort and future hope because he was dealing with and talking to churches who are already dealing with persecution. And he was saying, oh, yeah, I'm sorry, but it's going to get worse. And here's how you handle that. And it gives us some future look that then John deals with in Revelation. 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus and Philemon or Philemon, depending on how you pronounce that.
Philemon.
You've never heard that?
I don't.
A lot of Greek scholars will pronounce it that.
They're probably right, but I'm sticking with Philemon.
Yeah, I just say Philemon because it's different and catches people off guard. Yeah. Those are kind of what's called the pastoral. And Paul is dealing. These weren't written to groups of people. These were written to individuals. So in 1st, 2nd Timothy, he's teaching Timothy how to be a pastor. Yep. So it's for leaders in churches, which is all of us. Titus, leadership and expectations, kind of for the church in general. And then Philemon, this is an interesting one. It's a plea for a runaway slave. And there's a lot of people who have looked at that one and said, Paul is saying slavery is okay. But not when you look at the whole trajectory of the thing. Basically, he's recognizing a person who is in that economic system, a slave, as a human being that God loves. And saying to the slave owner, he is a brother in Christ, and you need to treat him accordingly. Even though, there's this owner and slave relationship in our world today, and it's a poor comparison. It's employee and employer kind of relationship. We would say, but it's slavery. Yeah, I get it. But he was speaking into the language of the culture of the day. But it shows us. Then we've got these others in the New Testament that aren't by Paul, but I think we should address. We talked about Hebrews, maybe the most deepest theological teaching alongside of Romans. I personally, and a lot of scholars think it was actually Apollos who read it because...
Who wrote it, you mean?
Who wrote it, yeah. Did I say
He might have read it, too.
He read it, too. Because it's very similar in style. And some of the people who mentored Paul and Paul mentored were mentors of Apollos, and he was known as a great teacher. There is also, and there's some decent evidence for this, that one of the early female pastors and leaders wrote this, and the reason that her name wasn't put on it was because they knew a lot of people wouldn't accept it if it was written by a female, which I just think that would be fascinating if that was the case. Of course, James, one of the most practical handbooks for
Great
Christian
book.
faith. I love James. 1st, 2nd Peter, A Life in a Messed Up World. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, kind of like a commentary and going deeper from the Gospel of John. And Jude, be careful and guard your heart. You have these others written by some of the other apostles and leaders of the early church. That takes us, we're almost to the end of our journey. That takes us through all of the New Testament now, except the book of Revelation, which is where we'll be next week.
That's what we're going to touch on next week. I'm excited for that one. That's going to be good. Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. It was still, like a brief survey of the New Testament here.
Yeah, it really feels that way.
Big chunk of the New Testament. But, as we've kind of been doing the whole time, all through this Greatest Story Ever Told, going through the whole Bible in 30 weeks, make sure you're reading along with us. That's our homework, our next step, whatever that we always talk about here on the Grow podcast. Growth always starts with the next step. not only is that a good practice for us while we're doing this, but it's building a discipline in all of us of consistently being in God's word. And so I hope that you're reading along with us. It's not too late to start. There's 1 week left. So start now. That's okay. You can start right now and then just continue on when we're done with the greatest story. But make sure that you're reading along with us as we go. And then, like Pastor Mike said, next week we're touching on Revelation.
Yep.
That'll be a 4.5 hour long podcast.
Sure.
So be ready for that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pastor Mike. Thanks to all of you for joining us as always. We love being able to spend this time with you, letting you kind of in on this conversation that I get to have with Pastor Mike. Make sure that you're subscribed, whether on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, so that you get notified when the new episodes go up every Monday. And until next time, we will see you later.